All right, so let's dive into what's happening over in Mozambique. Um, it's a story that's been making headlines recently, and it's honestly a bit of a wild one.
It is, yeah.
We've got post-election disputes, violence, and even a prison break right on Christmas Day.
Yeah,
It's hard to know where to even begin,
right.
but we're going to try to unpack all of it for you today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We've been digging into reports from all over, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, even Il Post in Italy,
Wow.
to try and get a clearer picture of what's going on. So the next, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, we're going to try to break it all down for you. Who are the key players here? What's at stake? And how did this whole situation get so explosive?
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me is just how quickly things seem to have escalated. It's gone from 0 to 60 in a matter of days.
Yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah.
So let's start by setting the stage a little bit right. Mozambique has been under the rule of the Frelimo party since 1975.
A long time.
That's almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And in this latest presidential election, their candidate, Daniel Chapo, was declared the winner.
And, when you have a single party in power for that long, there are always going to be questions about whether the system is truly fair and transparent.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Venancio Mondlane and his Podemos party come into the picture. They were the main challengers in this election, and they are not accepting the results at all. They're claiming the election was rigged, and their supporters have been protesting, some even resorting to violence, even before this whole prison break thing happened.
Right. And then you have the Constitutional Council, which is like their highest court for constitutional matters.
Yeah.
They upheld Chapo's victory on December 23rd. And that decision seems to have been the tipping point.
It really does feel like that court decision just ripped off a bandage and all this pent-up anger and frustration just poured out.
Yeah.
We're talking attacks on police stations, gas stations, banks even.
Chaos.
It's scary, frankly, if you're caught in the middle of it.
And it's not just property damage either. There are reports that at least 56 people have been killed since December 24th, including 2 police officers.
Wow.
These are numbers coming from groups like Plataforma Decide, which was monitoring the election, and various NGOs.
Those numbers are, they're really sobering. And, when you hear the Interior Minister, Pascal Ronda, talking about some of these groups using guns, that's when you know it's serious. This isn't just spontaneous anger. This feels more organized,
More coordinated.
more calculated. It makes you wonder, what's driving this level of escalation?
Yeah, and one of the interesting aspects here is the role of young people. The Interior Minister himself mentioned them specifically.
He did, yeah. He actually highlighted young Mondlane supporters as being a major force in all of this. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, Mozambique has a very young population, and youth unemployment is a huge problem. The World Bank estimates it's over 20%. So it's not surprising that young people who are facing such limited opportunities might be particularly susceptible to frustration and anger, especially if they feel like the system is rigged against them.
Makes sense, right? They're looking ahead and they don't see a fair shot.
Yeah.
And then on top of all of this, you have this incredibly dramatic prison break on Christmas Day. Talk about adding chaos to an already chaotic situation.
Yeah, it's almost hard to believe over 1,500 inmates escaped from Maputo Central Prison. That's just mind-boggling.
Out of how many?
Out of about 2,500, it was a riot. It started on Christmas Day.
And tragically, 33 people died in the chaos,
Yeah.
another 15 injured. It's just horrific. But what I find really interesting is that no one seems to agree on what actually caused the riot.
You've got the police general commander, Bernardino Rafael, saying that it was sparked by the protests happening outside. But then you have the justice minister, Helena Kita, insisting that the unrest started inside the prison, completely separate from anything going on in the streets.
So who do we believe?
It's hard to say for sure, but, when you read through the reports, you can't help but wonder, could the prisoners have actually planned this, using the holiday and the unrest as cover?
It's a good question.
There are reports that some of the prisoners overpowered guards and got hold of weapons, including AK-47s. Others suggest that security was more relaxed because it was Christmas, which made it easier for them to escape. Al Jazeera even quoted some security experts who believe the prisoners specifically chose Christmas because they knew things would be less secure.
I mean, if that's true, that's both incredibly clever and incredibly terrifying. It suggests a level of desperation, but also a strategic awareness of the bigger picture, the political climate. It's like they saw an opportunity in the chaos.
Absolutely. And even though they've recaptured about 150 of the escapees, the fact that so many managed to get out in the first place, it raises some serious questions about the state's ability to maintain order and control.
Right. I mean, this prison break, do you think it's possible it's more than just a random act of violence? Could it be another symptom of something deeper, something broken in the system?
I think that's a very valid question. The timing is just too coincidental, right? It happens at the peak of this post-election turmoil, right? When people are questioning the legitimacy of the government and its ability to protect them.
It feels like everything is connected, right? The election dispute, the violence, the prison break. It paints a pretty bleak picture of Mozambique right now.
It's definitely a complex and concerning situation, and while it's tempting to just focus on these immediate events, I think it's crucial to recognize that this unrest is probably stemming from deeper systemic issues within Mozambican society. These are issues that have been simmering for years, if not decades.
Okay, so we've got a disputed election, a wave of violence, and a prison break that feels like something out of a movie. And it sounds like this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's something much bigger going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. This isn't just about one election or one incident. This is about years of pent-up frustration, a desire for change, and a growing distrust in the systems that are supposed to serve the people. And to understand that, we need to listen to the voices of the Mozambican people themselves.
Yeah.
To hear their stories, their perspectives.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back to do just that.
You know, one person who really comes to mind as we talk about these deeper issues is Adriano Nuvunga.
Oh, yeah.
He's the director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Mozambique, and he's been incredibly vocal about the state's failings. Specifically, he's focused on the security and justice systems.
Oh, yeah, Nuvunga. He's been a powerful voice for change in Mozambique for years.
Yeah.
What's he been saying about this current situation?
He's been raising some really tough questions about how the government's handled the unrest. He's concerned about the heavy-handed response from the security forces and the lack of accountability for those using excessive force.
Yeah, that lack of accountability really feeds into what we were talking about earlier, that sense of a broken system, right? If people don't believe that the justice system is fair, that they can get a fair shake, it's no wonder they feel like they have to take matters into their own hands.
It's a vicious cycle, and it feeds into the distrust that Nuvunga's been warning about for years. He's been saying for a long time that unless the government addresses these fundamental issues, things are only going to get worse.
And tragically, it seems like his predictions are coming true. You know, this isn't the first time Mozambique has faced this kind of unrest. The country went through a brutal civil war that lasted 16 years. It ended in 1992. But those scars run deep. And I can't help but think that this current crisis is, in some ways, a reopening of those old wounds.
I think that's a really insightful observation. The trauma of that conflict is still very much alive in the collective memory of Mozambicans. And when they see this kind of violence erupting again, it triggers those memories, those anxieties about the fragility of peace.
It's like the country is standing on a fault line, and any tremor, any perceived injustice can cause the whole thing to crack open again. And that's what worries me. This situation has the potential to spiral out of control, and not just for Mozambique, but for the whole region.
Right. Instability in one country can easily spill over into neighboring nations, and we're already seeing signs of that. There are reports that some of the unrest has targeted critical infrastructure, like gas stations and banks.
Oh, that's right. And that kind of disruption can have a devastating impact on the economy. It creates fear and uncertainty, making it hard for businesses to operate, for people to live their lives. It discourages foreign investment, which Mozambique really needs to improve its economy. It's a recipe for a downward spiral.
And we haven't even mentioned the potential humanitarian crisis. If this violence keeps escalating, people are going to be displaced from their homes. They're going to struggle to get food, water, medical care. We can't lose sight of the human cost of this conflict.
You're absolutely right. Behind the headlines, behind the political analysis, there are real people whose lives are being shattered. We need to remember that.
We need to understand their stories, their fears, their hopes. And we need to ask ourselves, what role can the international community play in supporting them?
That's a big question, and one we need to grapple with. What kind of support does Mozambique need right now?
Well, at the most basic level, there's an urgent need for humanitarian aid. Organizations like the Red Cross and the UN are already working on the ground, providing food, shelter, medical care to those displaced by the violence.
So listeners who want to help, donating to those organizations is a really tangible way to make a difference.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps. But beyond that immediate humanitarian response, I think the international community needs to think more strategically about how to support Mozambique in the long term.
What do you mean?
Well, it's not enough to just put out fires. We need to address the underlying conditions that are creating this tinderbox. We need to support initiatives that promote good governance, transparency, accountability. We need to invest in education, job creation, especially for young people.
So it's about giving people hope, giving them a reason to believe in a better future.
Exactly. Because if people don't see a path forward, if they feel like they have no stake in the system, then this cycle of violence and instability is just going to continue. And that's a future that no one wants for Mozambique.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for humanitarian aid, for supporting good governance, for addressing those deeper issues of inequality and lack of opportunity. But what about the political side of things? What needs to happen there?
Well, the violence needs to stop. That's the first thing. All sides need to come to the table and start talking. And it can't just be about the election results. It needs to address the root causes of this crisis, the systemic issues that have been festering for years.
So we're talking about some tough conversations, right?
Yeah.
The conversations about power, about inequality, about how to create a system that works for everyone, not just a select few. I mean, how do we even begin to have those conversations in a climate that's this polarized, this distrustful?
It won't be easy. It's going to require a tremendous amount of goodwill, courage, and a willingness to compromise from all sides. But I do believe it's possible, and I think the international community can play a role in facilitating that dialogue, in creating a safe space for those conversations to happen.
What would that look like practically?
Well, it could involve bringing in mediators, experienced negotiators who can help bridge the divides between the government, the opposition, and civil society. It could involve providing technical assistance to help strengthen democratic institutions and processes. It could involve supporting civil society organizations that are working to promote peace and reconciliation at the grassroots level.
So it's about supporting Mozambicans and finding their own solutions.
Exactly. It's about empowering them to build the future they want for their country. And it's about recognizing that this is a long-term process, one that will require sustained commitment and collaboration from everyone involved.
All right, this has been incredibly insightful. Before we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into this complex situation, let's pause here for a moment. All right, so we've talked about a lot, the election disputes, the violence, the prison break, and really kind of the frustrations that seem to be fueling all of this unrest.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the question on everyone's mind is, what's next for Mozambique? Where do they go from here?
Yeah, it's a huge question. If we're trying to kind of look ahead, I think the immediate priority has got to be de-escalating the violence. Every life lost, every building burned, it just makes it that much harder to find a peaceful solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But how do you actually de-escalate a situation like this? I mean, it's easy to say stop the violence, but, things are a lot more complicated on the ground.
Yeah, it's going to take a multi-pronged approach for sure. First of all, the government, they have a big responsibility here. They need to make sure that the security forces are acting with restraint, that they're not using excessive force against protesters.
Right, because if they do, if the response is seen as heavy-handed or unjust, it's only going to make things worse, right? It'll alienate the people who are already feeling marginalized, unheard.
Exactly. Instead, the government needs to show a real commitment to dialogue, to listening to the grievances that people have, to addressing those underlying issues of inequality and corruption, the lack of opportunity that we talked about.
Yeah. So it's not just about stopping the unrest. It's about actually getting at the root causes, the systemic issues that have led to this boiling point.
Yeah.
But what about the opposition? The protesters, I mean, what role do they play in de-escalation?
They also have a responsibility to find ways to express their grievances peacefully. Violence, destruction. It ultimately undermines their cause and makes it that much harder to achieve their goals. They need to engage in dialogue, too, to work towards solutions that benefit everyone in Mozambique, not just a specific faction or party.
So it really does sound like you're emphasizing dialogue is the key to moving forward.
I think so, yeah.
But realistically, how do you get people to talk to each other, to listen to each other, when there's this much anger, this much distrust?
That's the challenge, right? And, it's not going to happen overnight. It requires building trust, finding that common ground, a willingness to compromise on all sides. And this is where maybe the international community can play a role, maybe by supporting mediation efforts, bringing in people who are experienced negotiators to help kind of bridge the divides. But ultimately, the solutions have to come from within Mozambique itself. It's got to be a Mozambican-led process.
So let's say, hypothetically, that the violence does de-escalate, that people are willing to sit down and talk. What are the key issues that need to be addressed in those conversations?
Well, like we said, it's not just about who won or lost the election. It's about creating a more just and equitable society. It's about tackling those issues that drove people to protest in the first place. Poverty, inequality, the lack of opportunity, and that sense that the system is rigged against them.
So Reforming the electoral system, tackling corruption, creating more economic opportunities, especially for young people. I mean, these are all huge undertakings. Do you think there's the political will, the capacity to actually tackle these issues?
That's a good question. And to be honest, it's the big unknown. It'll require a genuine commitment from everyone involved, from the government, from the opposition, from civil society, a willingness to put aside self-interest and really work together for the common good. And honestly, it's going to require a level of leadership that we haven't seen consistently in Mozambique, at least not in recent years.
It's a daunting task, there's no question. But if they can pull it off, if they can find a way to move forward together, what could the future look like for Mozambique?
I think there's actually a real opportunity here for Mozambique to not only heal from this crisis, but to actually emerge as a stronger, more united nation. They have so much potential, incredible natural resources, a rich culture, and a young, very dynamic population.
Yeah.
If they can harness that potential, if they can create a system that's truly inclusive and representative, then the future could be incredibly bright.
It's a good reminder that even in these dark times, there's always hope.
Absolutely. But, hope without action is just a wish. And the time for wishing is over. The time for action is now.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the unrest in Mozambique, I think it's important to remember how complex this situation is. There are no easy answers here, no quick fixes.
Yeah.
But we can't turn away from the challenges that they're facing, from the human suffering that's happening right now.
And it's also important to remember that what's happening in Mozambique isn't unique. We're seeing the same kind of unrest, this frustration with political systems all over the world. It's a reminder that fight for democracy, for justice, for equality, it's an ongoing struggle. And it's one that demands our attention, our empathy, and our active participation.
As we were preparing for this, one of the things that struck me was how many different perspectives there are on this situation, even among experts. It's a good reminder that there's no single truth here, no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It's about listening to those different voices, engaging in thoughtful debate, and being open to changing our minds as we learn more.
And it's about holding on to hope, even when things seem bleak. Because if we lose hope, then we've already lost.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage all our listeners to keep learning about this complex and evolving story, to seek out different perspectives, and to stay engaged in the fight for a more just and peaceful world.